Did you know that over the last 600 years, the world has had only 7 global reserve currencies? And guess what? Not a single one has lasted forever. The average lifespan is about 80 to 100 years. So, where does the US dollar stand in this historical cycle? Has it finally hit its expiry date? And more importantly, what comes next? Let's take a quick trip back in time. The very first global monetary empire was Portugal, way back in the 1400s. Their currency, the real, dominated trade for about 80 years. But then, devastating wars and excessive debt caused it to collapse. It's a pattern we're going to see again and again. Next up was the Dutch guilder. From 1640 to 1720, the Netherlands was the center of the financial universe. Their currency ruled global trade. But their reign ended after a series of financial bubbles burst and they suffered critical naval defeats at the hands of England. Sound familiar? Debt, war, and overreach. This brings us to the Third Empire. Great Britain. The British pound became the undisputed king, ruling the financial world for about 105 years. For over a century, as good as the pound was the ultimate measure of value. But then came World War I to fund the war. Britain printed massive amounts of money and took on staggering debt. By the end of World War II, the empire was financially exhausted, and the pound's dominance was over. Enter the United States. In 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They made a historic decision. The US dollar, backed B-gold, would become the new world reserve currency. At the time, the US held a staggering 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, giving the dollar an unmatched foundation of power and trust. For the next few decades, the system worked, the world rebuilt, and global trade flourished under the stability of the gold-backed dollar. But then, in 1971, a pivotal moment changed everything. President Richard Nixon, facing rising costs from the Vietnam War and domestic spending, made a shocking announcement. He unilaterally ended the direct convertibility of the US dollar to gold. This decision, known as the Nixon shock, effectively severed the dollar's last link to a physical asset. Overnight, the US dollar transformed from a currency backed by gold into a fiat currency, backed only by the full faith and credit of the US government. This move launched a new era of global finance. Without the discipline of the gold standard, there were no real limits on how much money the US could print or how much debt it could accumulate. And for the next 5 decades, that's exactly what happened. We embarked on a journey of massive money printing, unrestrained borrowing, and colossal government spending. So, where does that leave us today? History shows us a clear and repeating pattern. Every single reserve currency in history has eventually collapsed. And it almost always happens when its issuing nation's debt becomes unmanageable. The empire spends more than it earns, prints money to cover the difference, and eventually, the world loses faith in its currency. As of today, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency for about 80 years since Bretton Woods. And if we count from the end of the gold standard, we're well into the territory where past empires began to crumble. That 80 to 100-year average lifespan is looking less like a historical curiosity and more like a ticking clock. Now, let's look at the numbers, because they tell a frightening story. The US national debt has exploded. It has rocketed past $34 trillion and is climbing at an accelerating rate. To put that in perspective, the debt is now larger than the entire economies of China, Japan, Germany, and the UK. Combined, every few months, we add another $1 trillion. This isn't sustainable. On top of the debt, we have enormous military spending and persistent, massive fiscal deficits. The government is consistently spending far more than it collects in taxes, and it's financing this shortfall by printing more money and issuing more debt. This continuous dilution of the currency weakens the dollar's foundation from within, and the world is noticing. The dollar's dominance is visibly slipping. Just a couple of decades ago, over 71% of global foreign exchange reserves held by central banks were in US dollars. Today, that number has fallen to around 58%, and the trend is heading downward. This isn't happening by accident. Major global powers are actively working to move away from the dollar. This movement, often called de-dollarization, is being led by countries like China and Russia, along with the expanding BRICS alliance, which includes Brazil, India, and South Africa. They are tired of the US using the dollar as a tool of foreign policy, imposing sanctions and controlling the global financial system. Their solution: create parallel systems. The BRICS nations are developing their own payment systems to bypass the US-controlled SWIFT network. And it's not just them. Over 40 other countries have expressed interest in joining this alternative financial architecture. This is a direct challenge to the dollar's hegemony. We're also seeing this shift in the most critical market of all. For decades, the petrodollar system meant that oil had to be bought and sold in US dollars, creating constant global demand for the currency. But that's changing. We are seeing a significant rise in oil and gas being traded in other currencies, particularly the Chinese yuan. When Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system, starts openly discussing trading in yuan, a major shift is underway. So, what are central banks doing in response? They are buying gold. Lots of it. In fact, central banks around the world are buying gold at the fastest pace in over 55 years. Why? Because gold is the ultimate safe haven asset. It has no counterparty risk and has been a store of value for thousands of years. When faith in paper currencies falters, smart money has always turned to gold. Looking back at history, the value of gold always surges during the collapse of a reserve currency. Central banks are preparing for a future where the dollar is no longer king, and they are hedging their bets with the one asset that has outlasted every empire. Every monetary empire of the past collapsed under the weight of either a major war or an overwhelming debt crisis. Today, the United States is facing both simultaneously. We are entangled in geopolitical conflicts and proxy wars around the globe, while waging financial wars through sanctions. At the same time, our domestic debt crisis is spiraling out of control. This combination is a recipe for an accelerated decline. Famous investor Ray Dalio talks about a long-term debt cycle, which typically lasts about 75 to 100 years. According to his framework, we are at the very end of this cycle, a period characterized by zero interest rates, massive money printing, and extreme internal and external conflict. The signs he outlined are all around us. So what does the future look like? It's unlikely that another single currency, like the Chinese yuan, will simply replace the dollar overnight. The yuan has its own problems, like capital controls and a lack of transparency. Instead, the world is likely shifting toward a multipolar, multi-currency system. In this new world, USA's dollar, the euro, the yuan, and perhaps even other assets like gold or digital currencies will all share the stage. The dollar is still incredibly powerful today. Let's be clear about that. Its decline won't happen in a single day. But the process is accelerating. The foundations are cracking, and the rest of the world is actively building lifeboats. History teaches us one final, humbling truth. Empires are rarely conquered from the outside. They collapse from within. Rotting foundations, unsustainable debt, and internal division are what bring great powers to their knees. The real question isn't, will the US dollar fall from its throne? History has already answered that for us. The real question is when, and what will the world look like after it does? Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video.